So let's start. And so first introduction, this is us, Proce, 11, Elisa, and Retro from MakerDAO. Basically, we're governance design and DAO craft, and we also work for in the construction scope in
Tienen que arriar.
Yeah, works. And starting in MakerDAO, we have like a lot of experience basically in different, also in corporate, in startups and in Web3. So starting from Accenture, Amazon, like Syngenta, Radisson Hotels, going into startups, and then we are here as DAOcraft, and also we've been working for Chat Protocol, Maker, Contango, and some others. So, what is a workshop? Gracias. Gracias. And so, what is a workshop? So, the idea of this workshop is to engage, to learn, to have fun, but most important is to ask a lot of questions. So, I speak Spanish, I also speak Spanish, they speak English, so if there's at any point there is something that is not super clear, just ask Spanish, English, it doesn't matter, we can repeat that, but first of all, it's like, this is a workshop, so ideally, after this, you will say, okay, now I understand, and so I have something, more knowledge, and after this one. So, after saying this, so basically, first, let's start, as I said, like this is us and governance and operations, and we focus on design, basically. And we use different, so we have different tools for that, which are basically design thinking, Learn Six Sigma, gamification, and so we have a lot of stuff going on in DAOcraft. Sorry. And so, first, let's define what's governance design. So governance design is basically the process, so we have these 3 boxes, structures, in which we define and we design structure, processes, and systems, and that enables us for decision-making, to allocate resources wisely, let's say, or to switch if necessary, and to manage conflict. So this is basically us and what we do. So this is an example, what we did, for example, to say, let's design a sandbox. So we have 2, basically the left and the right picture, in which at the left side we have let's say it's an organization. In this, there is not a lot of structure. So we see, for example, a cage with different kids. We have a ramp here. They are not really aligned. So maybe it's working, but this is not efficient. And each of them, they are doing different stuff. And then on the right side, we can see so basically the sandbox is the resources are allocated in different positions. There is some organization, and basically they look like they are working all together and in a more efficient way. So basically, and this is an example of what we talked before.
And to bring it back to DAOs, everybody says that they're a DAO these days if you have a token, if you vote, but this really tries to focus on not all DAOs are the same, even if on the outside they might. So focusing on the requirements and trying to make some alignment about the purpose is also a major point of the design thinking that we try to implement and use both at Maker and other projects.
Exactly. Thanks. So then, and in practice, so we have people, situation, and incentives, and they are all basically, this is basically for organization, they are all connected. It could be by affinities, trade-off, documentation, and all are basically connected by change management, which means that if one changes, then could be that other one will change as well. And we need to reallocate and to basically to reallocate ressources and reshuffle again.
Yeah,
if we want to add something.
The other thing to call on this slide too is that change management is at the middle. So when DAOs first got started, there isn't a ton of structure. So making changes or introducing new proposals are usually a good thing. But now that they've been around for a while, and especially in the case of Maker, trying to evolve from the core unit model to the Endgame model, change management really surfaces as the most important part of governance design. Because if you remove one part of the process and you don't properly support it with either new mechanics or fully depreciating an entire work stream, you have governance debt, you have technical debt, or you just have a broken, buggy system, and now the legitimacy and the accountability of the entire governance structure is in question. So by pairing people with affinity to incentives, you get proper alignment, you get proper motivation. By pairing people with documentation, you get clear situations or clear literacy that isn't just necessarily like a bad thing when something breaks or if something needs to be changed, but even during the steady state, so people can really have an appreciation for how the operation runs. And then last but not least, situations and incentives are paired by trade-offs, because you can only spend $1 once, you can only dedicate one person to one project, at least efficiently in my mind. So then how do you make all of that work within a dynamic system? It's really about the process of change management, not necessarily just playing in a greenfield sort of experimentation. So that brings us to today's objectives. What we're going to do to really empower everybody here to be in a position to start writing proposals at your own DAOs or trying to get into DAOs is really break down the proposal writing process into parts. We're first going to talk about primitives, which for some of the developers in the room, you may be familiar with that concept. If you're not, don't worry. We have a couple of examples to walk through. From there, we will use primitives to build mechanisms or just repeatable processes or frameworks. And then last but not least, we'll really allow you guys to start playing and practicing with this. We'll ask you to get into groups of about 4 or 5 people, pass out some materials that we've prepared, and then see what sort of governance designs that we could make. And I think the interesting thing, too, is that Maker really has an opportunity for your ideas to take place and start pulling in people. For those that aren't aware, Maker is attempting to launch about 6 DAOs called sub-DAOs that support the ecosystem. We'll get in that to a minute, but the work just won't be fully practiced if you don't want it to be. So first, let's start breaking down primitives. For those, again, that are developers, you may have an appreciation for this already. Primitives are the fundamental element that serves as the foundation for a programming language. I'm sure people know variables and have seen them before. Some examples that we have are ints, strings, and floats, just different ways to represent data in a consistent manner. For governance design, that gets a little bit more abstract. It's hard to make a one-to-one analogy, but again, just thinking about it in terms of trying to solve one specific problem with one generic and unbiased tool is the correct way to think about it. So some of the examples that we listed could be different versions or different orders just to track how things are evolving. Results or outcomes are also a very nebulous thing. It's a little abstract, but if you try to break down a process that completes one step after another, and then you have this massive result, maybe it's better to start thinking about those things as smaller bite-sized pieces. And then last but not least, assessing or understanding or having a process to consistently mature your organization, whether you're a DAO, decentralized or not, is key for organizational growth. During the interactive part of the workshop today, we'll be passing out a deck of cards. And the important part for right now is just understanding that one card represents a primitive or a tool to use in a mechanism. So now that we have the building blocks, what are we trying to build? How do we leverage this in proposals? A mechanism, again, in the computer science or traditional definition could be seen as a process that takes input, that runs a routine, produces an output, and may or may not be dependent on the state of the system. In governance design, I think this is a little bit easier to appreciate than a primitive. It's just a repeatable process that typically lives within some sort of structure or done by some sort of team. And another word for it could just be a framework. So for the traditional examples, that would be a for loop or any named function. But in governance design, it's really focused on input, process, output. So some of the things that you may be familiar with are periodic governance cycles, the weekly cycle, the monthly cycle, even annual elections if your DAO uses that, or budget requests, like a grant process or an internal team getting funding and making proposals for future work. For the workshop today, it's best to appreciate that a collection of primitives makes a mechanism. So pretty simple. But how do you start to evaluate mechanisms, right? Is it really just you do follow these steps, you have some different categories of primitives? In our mind, we've really distilled down powerful governance mechanisms into a collection of 4 different categories. In Maker, they were started, I believe it was motivation, was how every MIP started. And that was nice to appreciate, the current situation that the DAO was in, what was trying to be solved, but it really lacked teeth. So we call it strategy here at DAOcraft. So that really just means where are we going, right? What are we trying to solve? Knowing the situation's good for the discussion of trying to get a proposal passed, but when you're writing something that hopefully is going to stay within the DAO and live consistently, you probably don't need those situational awareness, because if you read some of the stuff from 2001 when the DAO was first introduced, it's not relevant anymore. There's all these legacy terms that just kind of confuse people. So breaking things down and focusing on the strategy from an organizational design perspective is where we start. An example of a primitive that fits into strategy could be growth. It doesn't need to be super complex. It just needs to be something that everyone can find agreement around and understand. Again, thinking of in terms of literacy. So once you have the strategy, again, growth, how do you make decisions around what is growth or what isn't? Consensus is a hard word, and we're still trying to come up with a better term. So if you have an idea, please let us know. But we keep seeing this term of consensus pop up. And what this really means for today's exercise and governance design is it's like a trigger mechanism, like a cron job. Like, what filters good decisions or bad decisions, or what are the filters within the process? So an example of a consensus mechanism could be a vote. Does the DAO want to do this or not? It could also be a committee, or it could be time-based. It could be the state of the system. If a metric falls below a certain line, then this process is triggered. That then takes us to coordination, frameworks and processes. I think everybody's fairly familiar with this. One example could be submitting an application. The application is a coordination tool, and then how that gets evaluated is the process, say for grants. And then past that, everything needs gas, right? Ethereum needs gas, people need motivation. It can be monetary motivation, but true DAOs that are successful really run on having a greater purpose. So Maker is evolving to be a purpose-driven organization. The parent organization of Maker is about enabling an unbiased global world currency, but how do we get there? Over the past year, we've seen different debates about what is DAI. Is it debt? Is it currency? Is it some representation of collateral? Well, what if it's all of those things? So today's workshop will really be focused on how do we create strategies and trigger mechanisms to coordinate this incentive of creating alignment around a purpose within an organization. So let's stop here. Are there any questions? I'm not just talking up here to talk to myself, so please, questions are good. Would be happy to field any if there are, but if they're not, just shout if they come up, by all means. Using what we just talked about as an example then, let's say, we're hungry, right? What's an easy, tangible example where we can use this? So we want to coordinate eating, right? We want to develop a mechanism for how do we pick a meal with a friend. So the strategy is really simple. We just want to eat. That's it, right? Real simple strategy. From there, we're using time as the coordination primitive, which says it's 9 p.m., so that decides what we eat. You're not going to eat breakfast late at night. Again, very simple application of the concept of primitive. From there, how do we know where to go? Who's going to make what? Let's meet at the nicest restaurant in town since it's at dinner. And then this solves the simple incentive of, we're not going to be hungry anymore. There's no money associated to it. There's no competition. It's just we accomplished the strategy of fulfilling our hunger. But super simple, so let's hand it over to the guy with a lot more experience to see how we can.
First of all, is it clear for all? You will need to understand this because then you are gonna be the ones like working with this. So please, again, like raise your hand if you have any questions and feel free to do it.
All right, so now let's imagine that you did complete the successful dinner outing with your friends, right? You met up. Unfortunately, there were a few drawbacks. A couple of your buddies could only be there for like 2 hours. You thought, okay, that's no worries. We'll get dinner together. 2 hours, plenty of time. But then you had some other buddies that showed up like an hour and a half late. So that meant the whole group was only together for 30 minutes. Clearly, you got some work to do before the next time you go out and arrange a meal together. So why don't we change our strategy a little bit, right? In that first example, we just wanted to eat. Now, we want to eat at a certain time. Like, the time isn't just our consensus mechanism. It's an actual strategy of, okay, we need to get our friends together all at the same time. You'll notice, like, a lot of the other stuff still makes sense, right? Like, we can still use that time to come together. We can still go to the nicest restaurant in town. But this time, we really do want to make sure that we get quality time together. So one kind of cool way to go about this workshop, because you're going to be talking to others, you're going to be coming up with different ways to do things, is to think, all right, what's the smallest change I can make that'll have a positive improvement? So here, what if we were to change the incentive and say, you know what, obviously at the end of the meal we have to pay, maybe before you all split the bill. To make sure everyone's on time, how about the last person to arrive has to pay the bill? All right, next time you go out and eat, you say, all right, well, our strategy should ensure that people are getting there at a much more reasonable time because no one wants to be stuck with the bill. And this is a really good example for how governance coordination works, because every time you try something, it's not going to work in the real world like you think it is in your head. So you need to make these little tweaks, you need to make observations, and you need to gather input from others to come up with a better result. All right, so now is when we're going to ask for a little participation. This isn't the full thing, but let's start to get into it. Common problem that DAOs have, right? Let's run a grant program. We got a bunch of tokens. We need to give them out to people so they do cool things and attract more cool people and more tokens. So that is our strategy, right? Let's do a grants program. What might be a consensus? Does anyone have any ideas for, like, okay, we've got a pot of money. How are we going to decide what to fund? To vote, all right, great idea. We can
Perfect.
Sorry, go ahead. We can use voting, all right? Simple voting, are we just going to say yes, no to everything? Are there other ways we could choose funding? I don't know how many of you are familiar with like Gitcoin, right? They have like quadratic grants. Maybe we say, hey, how about everyone gets 10 votes and we quadratically determine based on how they go out, right? You can see how the consensus mechanism might change a little bit. And then that might lead into coordination, right? So you've decided you want to vote. Now, how are you going to coordinate? How are we going to make sure that accountability happens? Anyone have any ideas for making sure that your grants voting actually comes to something? Who is going to make these decisions? All right, so the DAO has voted. We're sending out money. Now what? Do you need a council? Do you need a president? Do you need a weekly meeting in person to come up with things?
Do you need a sticky note with steps written on it, basically? Like, throw out any example. We'll just rapid fire through this.
Let's go. So it's all on chain. I love it. That's a great example of coordination. And how about incentive, right? So maybe you've got a large DAO and no one really wants to vote. Are there any incentive mechanisms people can think of that might help voting? Okay, there you go. That's maybe one person, but how do you make sure that your DAO actually cares, right? Throw a party? All right, I like that. Throw a party and do the voting at the party. All right, there you go. So see how you just kind of rush brainstormed a mechanism that we can use later.
All right, so what we're starting to pivot into now, I think everybody has a good appreciation. The challenge that we're going to throw out there is how can we, start brainstorming and mapping out an aligned DAO around a purpose and making sure it's very resilient. We'll get into those requirements in a minute, but just to introduce you to the deck of cards that we've made, this is just a first experimentation. It was about a week of thought that went into it to prepare for a couple other workshops, and we've seen some success. So again, would welcome any feedback. But real loosely, the strategy, consensus, coordination, and incentive categories are separated by suit. So if you're stuck on a proposal and you need some help brainstorming, that's really what these cards represent. If you want to put a different strategy as an incentive or just mix up the categories, go for it. Like, there really are no rules. This is just kind of like Play-Doh, just trying to get the conversation started and jumpstart things. From there, what you see is a way to also map out the grants program. So the example that we have up here, this card is called Secret Ballot. It doesn't really represent, a growth strategy or this strategy, but there's a narrative behind Secret Ballot that the group understood when we were putting this together. We didn't want reputation and politics to play into picking who chooses what grant. So as a strategy, we're going to say it's a secret ballot. It's really just about the proposal. There's no identification of teams. So then how does that flow into the rest of the grants process? It's just simple yes-no voting. We then did time-bound funding for our example to say that you have a month, your funding is bound. And then there's two incentive mechanisms. What you'll start to see is that there'll probably be a lot more incentive mechanisms than anything else because incentive really drives the DAO. We have token stream as one incentive, which says for the month that the grant is running, you get compensated for it to do your work. And then there's vesting, so then at the end of, say, a year, once the performance of the product or project you turned in is completed, then your full amount vests, maybe depending on some other conditions. Again, just an example. So let's move on to the main course. What we would like to do today is introduce you also to the process that DAOcraft uses to get something from the discussion phase or being identified as a problem or an opportunity within governance, all the way through writing it to the MIP framework or getting it passed as a law. That's an extensive process, so what we'll do today is really just focus on the first two stages, which is making sure that the problem is clearly defined, and then moving on to a possible solution that you'll invest further documentation, research, and campaigns around to get accepted. So as a next step, you guys look like you're fairly in groups already. You may want to join somebody else, so please feel free. But right now, it'd be best if we could just pair up a little bit, and then we'll pass out some materials.
Yeah, we would. We would need to. So for people who are alone, we would need to to create some groups. So please feel free to join others, and I will keep some decks and papers for working.
So what we're going to do is pass out, again, the deck of cards, and we have a couple worksheets that are just made to help facilitate the conversation. The goal of today is to design a governance process that creates alignment within contributors. It creates resiliency within the organization, so there's no single point of failure. There's no way that the process could be compromised. And last but not least, again, trying to align it around a purpose. We have, again, 3 governance experts here. So if you start to get stuck, raise your hand. We'll be walking around the entire time. And the DAO's environment is, again, focused on being a sub-DAO for Maker. So I'll spend a couple minutes talking about that while things are being passed around. If you have questions, I'm happy to leave. This is one of the workshop slides. But again, happy to go into detail elsewhere. But first and foremost, what you need to understand is that you're going to inherit things from the core. So you don't have to come up with everything. You just have to focus on these 3 problems. Maker is defining for people what work is allowed. It's defining the governance cycles and the timing, so the logistics about the operations are being handed to you. And what's going to happen with the profits, that's also being taken care of. The problems that you guys have to solve again is what is going to keep the internal workforce aligned? And what are maybe some mechanisms that could be used to say, you know, you should probably move on. You should probably get out of our group, go find another one because you're being more disruptive than supportive. Evaluation frameworks for being disruptive and alignment then is an excellent opportunity. Another one is coordinating work in any market condition. So understanding again, how is the function of this sub-DAO going to be in steady state? If you guys are starting to make less profits or take a look at potentially having to cut teams, what happens? What are those frameworks? What are those strategies? What are those the problems that you'd like to address, and which ones are pivotal to this sub-DAO that will always have funding? And then last but not least, how do you guys reinforce a shared purpose? I would be very interested to see how you guys can leverage reputation as well as anything else besides money to really incentivize a workforce for completing the strategy. Again, as we pass out the cards, you're fully encouraged to either just write simply in the box, come up with your own ideas, and this may seem like a big thing. So within your group, I would spend about 2, maybe 3, 5 minutes just talking about what's a specific problem that relates to alignment, resiliency, or purpose that you guys want to tackle first. And then, if that goes super well, try to add on another mechanism, and try to add on another mechanism. Because again, for those that aren't aware, when Maker first wound down the foundation and decentralized, I think it was back in 2021, the foundation handed over about 10 MIPS. And that was really just the base operational framework to get things jump-started. And then from there, I think we're at like 116 now or something like that. So it's a slow process. Start with the most important problem that you guys can solve the easiest, and then layer on as time allows. But we're happy to kick things off here. If there's any questions before we just start letting you guys discuss, please. Yeah, definitely. So this is more later on, right? But what this really means in a practical sense, like as you're living and working in a DAO, is this is probably going to start in the Discord, right? The chat room, saying, hey, this popped up, or a comment in a forum. Once you've seen it consistently enough, there's going to be some perspective that forms around it. So within your group or with the community, maybe on a community call, there's going to be some ideas that are pitched. They're probably going to be informal, they're probably going to be back of napkin, messy, but after a while, again, you'll start to see a consistent theme form or a really good idea pop up. And then from there, it usually moves into a Figma or a flow chart or something that's a little bit more concrete and harder to change from, just smudging your finger here or there. It really turns into a structure. But structures are only as good as they're defined. So once you have the high-level framework identified, you have to start filling in the gaps and attacking the edge cases and defining things that for any situation where this comes up, there needs to be a process, right? Because again, unless you're appointing somebody and you're trusting their decision within like a committee or some sort of defined role, there should be a known expectation of what happens for any branch, of the process tree. Specifically to your question then, frameworks and bylaws, that fits the formatting of whatever governance structure is being suggested, it's being introduced, and the change management circle is the focus here. So then how can we use existing structures or existing teams? Are we needing to create new teams? If we need to create new teams, is there another bylaw or a framework that then can support it? And what we've often found is, again, once our MIPS hit, the upper 50s, there's all these other tools that we could leverage. So here, we're designing in more of a greenfield isolation and kind of ignoring reality. But in these later steps, when we're trying to really solve the edge cases and use the existing structure and really focus on good change management, that's when they really turn into like a powerful framework. Or again, a law, a MIP, an IP, a BIP, some.
So we really like to use the analogy of like trying to improve the plane while flying it while we were at Maker, right? So imagine this is your chance you're about to get on a DAO plane together. You're going to set out some basic rules to at least make sure that once you get up in the air, it's going to keep flying for the first bit. You can improve it later, but this is really your chance to say, okay, I'm about to start my own DAO, my own sub-DAO with Maker. What are some things I'm going to do to make sure that I get along and all the people on the plane should really be on the plane helping us fly it together? Entonces, vamos? Yeah, so yeah, go ahead, question.
No, so the grant program was just super simple so we could try to get some engagement, make sure we understand. What we'd like to do is, again, everybody in this room now is the founding committee of a sub-DAO. So a sub-DAO is a extension or an affiliated company or organization of Maker Core. So you're not going to go out like Noun DAO and make comic books and all these other things. You're trying to support the Maker ecosystem, which produces DAI, right? The whole point of Endgame is to create alignment within your workforce. It's to make sure that your sub-DAO is hyper-resilient against regulatory concerns, against market conditions, against bad actors. And then the real challenge that we're hoping to see some innovation around from this group today is how do you align the workforce around a purpose? How do you define purpose? How do you measure purpose? So anything associated to those things are really what we'd like to challenge this group. But at the end of the day, if you come up with a really cool grants program, I'll be excited too. So it's whatever challenge you would like, but this is the ones that we would be happy to help, really start to dive into, would really love to answer questions. But again, grants, fair game, happy to help.
So yeah, just imagine you're about to get a whole bunch of people that want to come and join the cool stuff that you're building. How are you going to keep it so that no matter how many people join or where they're from or what have you, they're going to be aligned, they're going to keep the organization running, and they're going to contribute to your sense of purpose?
So as a closing, and I hope you enjoyed and you learned something, as we said at the beginning. If you have more questions, please feel free to ask us. And so here are our Twitters. If you want to continue talking with us, if you want to basically know more about governance and how this works. And also we created a POAP, which is basically in the right side of the presentation, our email. So if you want to have your proof of attendance, please feel free to reach us. And Retro, we want to add something?
Thank you for everyone for coming. Just as another shout out, take your mechanisms to forum.makerdao.com. There's about 6 sub-DAOs that are waiting for participation. First come, first serve is kind of the name of the game right now, so act on it if you're really interested. Otherwise, hit us up with any questions, and thank you again.